Well, this week's discussion of Behind the Headlines, we're going to talk about affordable housing, a new nonprofit that aims to get us to change the way we commute to work, and neighborhood engagement plus more. And we have a wonderful guest this episode, City Councilman Cory Wolbach, elected in November of last year. Cory, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Janani, why don't you get us kicked off on our discussion this week?
Yeah, so I think our first topic is housing, which I think is very appropriate because it's probably the topic that Cory Wolbach spoke the most about when he was running for council last year. And I think what kind of struck me is that when the council kind of convened for its first two meetings, the big topic was Buena Vista, and you had dozens of people talking about not wanting to be displaced from Palo Alto. And then just earlier this month, we had another contingent talking about not wanting to be displaced, but they couldn't be any more different from the Buena Vista residents. We had attorneys, Morrison Forster partner talking about how their employees can no longer live here. You had high-tech people, many millennials, not all, but so different contingents kind of talking about the subject. And I guess the first question I have is, can you tell me a little bit about why this was such a big part of your platform when you were running? Why this is so high up on your priority list?
Sure. As I think we all know, in Palo Alto and the Bay Area as a whole, but in particular in Palo Alto and San Francisco, housing cost is some of the worst in the nation. By some studies, the worst in the whole country. Certainly not unique to us, and we can talk more about what I've seen as I've actually traveled a little bit in the last few months to other parts of the country and seen them dealing with the same issues, with a lot of the same debates and challenges around housing and transportation, managing that. But it really creates a lot of challenges. As I discussed a lot last year, before the election, we're all concerned about change in the community and losing what makes Palo Alto special. But if a lot of the people who've been here a long time get priced out, that raises a lot of questions for the future of the community. And actually, I'd like to just as a quick reminder, the meeting we had about a week and a half ago, Monday night, about a week and a half ago, we had a lot of people come and speak about housing, turning on its head the previous depiction that it was just a bunch of millennials who were looking for housing, or tech workers or law firm employees who were having a tough time finding places. You also had some pretty established, people from the residentialist camp in Palo Alto, people like Arthur Keller and Bob Moss, identifying the need for greater housing options, addressing seriously the housing cost issue, and even advocating for more small units of housing. So what I've seen is actually important development and evolution of the conversation. For me, it's gratifying because I no longer feel like the voice of the wilderness saying housing's a critical issue.
But the very Bob Moss you mentioned is also part of the campaign in 2013 to overturn, the Maybell development. So, even if you have people agreeing on the problem, which is not enough housing, solutions seem to be a little harder to come by. So what is your answer to that fact? We know there's not enough housing, but what do you think are the best ways to encourage that in Palo Alto, where the political climate is still kind of resistant to growth?
Well, I think the first thing, again, is to remember it's not just Palo Alto's problem. We can't solve it on our own, but we can't just wash our hands of it and say every other city needs to do their part and we're not going to do ours. It's really a regional issue. And if you look at every other city on the peninsula, they're all having the same conversations, which for me is a sign of hope, that everybody at the county supervisor level and at the city level, everybody is talking about this and experimenting with different options, having study sessions about different options. And so my attitude is we should take an all of the above approach, at least in studying the options available.
There's a lot above. All of the above?
We should
10-story buildings?
Well, we should.
Manhattan?
Well, actually, and maybe that's one that, actually, as I've said in the past, I haven't advocated for changing Palo Alto's height limits.
So some of the above.
Okay. So some of the above.
Most of the above.
But as far as the different kinds of policies we should explore, you could maybe break it into a few different buckets of policy options. One is a range of policies to increase the overall supply, so we can address this fundamental peninsula and particularly acute in Palo Alto jobs housing imbalance. So you need to deal with overall supply to some degree. We'll probably never balance out perfectly, and that's okay. But we can use a little bit more overall supply. Also, as many below market rate units as possible. And Beyond that, another bucket of policies to consider are things to prevent displacement of people who are here right now who might be facing eviction or rent increases. And let me just say, when you talk about, or when I mentioned the idea of addressing displacement, people immediately think I'm saying rent control. And I just want to make very clear, rent control in the traditional sense is illegal in California, so that's a non-starter. And while rent stabilization is one of the possible considerations, I'd also point to what we did with Buena Vista, or are trying to do with Buena Vista, which is not forcing anything on anybody and no tougher regulations, but saying maintaining existing residents in our community is a real priority for us. So we're going to invest in that, even using public funds or using funds that we've collected from developers over the years for affordable housing.
Well, you identified the buckets, but what goes in the buckets? I mean, you're talking about expanding supply, but how would you practically do it? I mean, you can't expand housing supply without building more houses, right? So which just begs the question, where would you build them and how?
Well, actually, sometimes you might be able to add some more supply and find some more spots for people to live without building a whole lot more. As you know, we were talking about before this, there's a colleagues memo that I took the lead on that's with a couple of my colleagues that's coming to council for initial review and hopefully quick referral about accessory dwelling units, also known as second units, in-law units, or granny units. And ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, are a second unit on your property. That could be a standalone structure, or it could be attached, or perhaps even a subdivision within an existing home. Like you take, say, an Eichler house. I live in one, and a lot of my neighbor and colleague Greg Schmid lives in one. You grew up in one. A lot of Eichlers in Palo Alto today are occupied by an elderly couple, or maybe even a widow or a widower. Their family is growing up, the kids have moved out, and it's what we call kind of an empty nest. And a lot of people in that situation would be really happy to rent out a part of their house, but they like a little bit of extra privacy. And so if you could maybe take a master bedroom and turn the door from the master bedroom into the hallway into a wall. Most of those Eichler master bedrooms already have an exterior entrance. That's an option to create a second unit very easily. Could be changed back later. Doesn't add any new structure to the neighborhood.
Let me challenge the very easily assumption, because exactly 10 years ago, in 2005, the city council was dealing with exactly the same dilemma. They were considering loosening the rules for secondary, I call them granny units, but I know you're not a big fan of that, accessory dwelling units. And at that time, there was a very close vote, and by a single vote, they decided not to do it because neighbors were concerned about their own privacy if their neighbor builds these, and kind of disruptions to kind of their quality of life. As you know, Eichlers are all about kind of outdoor space and kind of blurring the line. So even building structures in the backyard, that could encounter resistance. And I think it was also funny reading a story from 10 years ago written by Jocelyn. There was a quote from a councilwoman at the time, Doris Cordell, a judge very well known locally. Her quote at that time, she voted against this, was, "It isn't like people are being squeezed out and nobody could rent here. I don't see the crisis." So I think you can make an argument that situation has changed. But do you anticipate that these kinds of problems that people brought up in 2005 about granny units possibly causing a disruption for neighbors propping up again this year?
I think that all of the concerns that were raised then will probably be raised again. And I think that it's important to address them seriously. And that's why, again, my focus with making it easier to add accessory dwelling units, because it's so difficult right now under Palo Alto's ordinances, my focus is especially on those that don't add to the FAR, the floor area ratio, the size of the structure, don't go up, any higher, don't intrude on privacy of the neighbors. I think that should be our first priority. I do think that for standalone structures, for additional ADUs, I think that our existing regulations are a little bit too tight. Our old comprehensive plan from '98 says that we should look at Bs and Ds. And our recent update to our housing element that we just passed, several months ago, that also says we should have this conversation. So what we're trying to do is move the conversation forward. And, as I think is pretty clear, from the time we had the discussion, a decade ago until now, the situation's changed. People are getting priced down, and people are looking for whatever options they can find, whether it's for a renter or for an extended family member.
I think it's funny that she uses the quote, "I don't see the crisis." You guys used the word housing crisis in your memo like 2 or 3 times, so I guess
things have changed in the last decade, for sure.
They definitely have. I think the problem with the conversation and getting people onto the same page is that some people are very entrenched in the idea of You can't add single-family homes. That's kind of the ideal, suburban housing. And if you have ADUs, then there's going to be more traffic. There's going to be more noise. How do you get those people to feel like, yes, we've heard you, and yeah, this is also a path that we as a community need to go down?
Well, making it easier for somebody to add an ADU to their property doesn't necessarily mean everybody's going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's important to think about, let's say you want to add an ADU in an area like downtown or some other neighborhood that has parking shortage. Mm-hmm. I'd be open to saying that if you're the resident of an ADU, you maybe aren't as eligible for one of the neighborhood parking permits. So you're going to need to figure out your parking situation yourself. It's a similar attitude that I've had about another initiative that I've at least said we should explore, which is maybe some multifamily zoning allowances, especially in places near Caltrain stations, where you'd actually have, and this is radical for Palo Alto, but it's worked other places, no parking or very, very little parking. Mm-hmm. And perhaps we're gonna have to work with our city attorney and see if it's legally an option, but maybe have as a condition of approval for the project that every tenant needs to sign a lease agreement that says, I will not own a car. And then they have to rely on public transportation, car share, ride share, bikes, and things like that.
That proposal made my jaw drop when you kind of brought it up at the council meeting, actually.
I mean, it was regarding the Page Mill, El Camino.
Yeah, it was.
I floated the idea in talking about Page Mill and El Camino.
Yeah,
I don't know if it'll work
it,
there or not, but I think it's worth discussing.
I mean, and I can see why you're bringing it up, because obviously parking and traffic are the big impacts of new housing and the big impediment to why why there's a political kind of opposition to new construction. But at the same time, there's the baser part of our natures that likes cross-country trips and Steve McQueen movies that says, how dare you taking away our car rights?
Well, I'm not looking to take away anyone's cars. But
I'm curious, where has that worked? Where did this idea come from? Because I'm glad you brought it up. I did want to ask you.
Well, here's the deal. I think that a lot of folks have a particular sense of what their quality of life is. Mm-hmm. And, whether it's the person who has a big house and a big yard and a couple of cars, and that's mm-hmm. their ideal quality of life. Mm-hmm. Or the person who wants a really small apartment right near downtown and doesn't want a car and doesn't want a yard, doesn't want to deal with that hassle. For each of them, that's an ideal situation. And I think it's important for us to remember that not everybody else wants exactly what we want. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people say, whether it's a millennial or maybe a senior who's looking to downsize and doesn't feel as comfortable driving as much anymore, there are a lot of people in Palo Alto who I've heard from who say, I'd love to have options for a smaller place. I don't need to own a car. I don't want to deal with the hassle. And, well, let's give them a chance to prove it. I think the option should be there for those who would try. And I'm saying let's maybe try it as a pilot program. And there have been developments in other cities. San Francisco and Berkeley, I know, that focus on this really smaller apartments. These are the kinds that...
San Francisco does that in some places?
There are some in San Francisco. I haven't had a chance to look at them in person yet, but I'm planning to go up there and actually, put my eyeballs on them and really see what it looks like in person, because nothing compares to seeing a real world example.
In addition to the accessory dwelling units, are you really thinking that the additional housing would come in the form of high density projects? I mean, we're not really envisioning any kinds of single family home type, townhome style developments in Palo Alto, are we? There's just not enough room, it seems.
Perhaps, again, when I talk about all of the above, it's, consider all of the options, and where it's appropriate, try just about anything. But the kinds of developments that I'd be talking about here with, whether you call them small units or micro apartments, I'm talking about ones that would still be constrained by our height limits, constrained by, our size limits. So you wouldn't want to build a bigger density of structures, but allow more units within that. Mm-hmm.
I had one question about the meeting that happened a week and a half ago, where there were a lot of people who came to speak. There was some speculation on Town Square that there had been some sort of organized movement politically to motivate people to come to that meeting and speak out. And I was wondering if the group Palo Alto Forward is certainly pro-housing options. I was wondering if you have any insight into how all those people ended up and whether it had anything to do with Palo Alto Forward.
Well, I'm not on the steering committee for Palo Alto Forward, but I have some friends who are part of that, and I also know some people who are part of some of the other organizations in town who are focused on land use issues. I think it's, we've seen over the last few years, it's pretty common, that people who are passionate about an issue will tell their friends, hey, council's going to be discussing this issue at the meeting coming up. Encourage you to come out and talk about it. Whether it's people advocating for addressing parking problems in downtown or adding more housing options. And I think that I know that Palo Alto Forward and maybe some other groups too, that's the one I was aware of, definitely said, yeah, this is an important issue, let's raise our voices. But again, what was interesting was there's the common depiction of, who's advocating housing in Palo Alto, and then there's the reality of the kinds of people we actually saw speaking to council that was not the stereotype of the young millennial looking for housing.
Just to Jocelyn's point, Palo Alto Forward did send out an email telling people that this is happening, they should come out and speak, but I think that's completely appropriate and what every group should be doing, because the more people come out and speak, obviously, the more people get representation in front of the council. But I want to steer back for just 1 second, back to the grand unit question, because you did mention the recently adopted housing element, and I think the one thing that's striking about the document is just how modest a proposal, or just how modest a factor grand units are right now in the city's thinking. Palo Alto has to plan for nearly 2,000 units in the next 8 years. Grand units, by the city's envisioning, would make up 32 of those. So it's like a very, very tiny fraction. And the basis for that calculation is Palo Alto gets about 4 per year currently. Over the time frame, it would be 32. So given the scale of the problem, how big of a solution do you think these little units could make? I mean,
well, it's hard to know at this point. One of the reasons we only get a handful of applications a year is because the vast majority of single-family homes in Palo Alto don't meet the very extremely stringent requirements that Palo Alto requires to add an ADU. And so what we see instead is people adding ADUs or converting garages and things like that and never telling the city about it. And that's actually one of my other big concerns.
It's addressed in the memo too.
That we mentioned in the memo. Thanks for pointing that out. That there are a lot of not code compliant ADUs out there right now. I'd like to kind of bring them out of the shadows and see if we can help work with people to bring them up to code, because that's it's a safety concern. And if somebody's living there, I want to make sure they're living in a safe place.
It's interesting that I would presume would also enable that unit to be counted as housing, as new housing for the housing element.
And I think you're referring to the regional housing allocation.
Right, the RENA.
And it's important to remember that what Palo Alto is required to do under the state mandate is to zone for more housing, to identify where housing could be added.
Right.
In the past, we have not built very much of what we had projected, but I think some other cities have looked at and have identified ADUs as a potential place to cover some of their zoning and planning, and that can help address our RENA requirements. So we could kind of kill two birds with one stone with this.
Well, let's move the conversation to transportation.
Sure.
Janati, your cover story today was on the new Transportation Management Association and nonprofits aiming to reduce solo driving by commuters to the city, especially downtown. And Cory, you were saying that this, in your campaign, that this was one of the most important decisions that the council had made previously. So I'm wondering, we're 9-10 months into the TMA steering committee doing their visioning. They've run a survey. They've talked with some car ride companies. How do you feel the progress is going with this group so far? Understanding that you've also said that housing is kind of dependent on having good transportation options into the city.
Absolutely, and kudos to Janati. The two articles I was reading them this morning before I came in here, and I think you did a great job, covering what's been happening with the TMA, the Transportation Management Association. And maybe we should just identify, in case we start using, there's a lot of alphabet soup out there, a lot of acronyms around transportation just for people watching us. Maybe we should just cover a few of them right now. TMA is the Transportation Management Association, right? We have SOV, Single Occupancy Vehicle.
Let's just call it solo drivers.
Or solo drivers.
It's a little safer.
I might slip into SOV, so I want to make sure that's out there. SOV is Single Occupancy Vehicle trips, somebody driving by themselves, not carpooling, not taking transit, not walking or biking. TDM, Transportation Demand Management, which is, could be a suite of various, policies to in an organized way, try and reduce the single occupancy vehicle trips. Am I forgetting any? And then RPP, the residential
Yep.
permit parking program for downtown.
So if you're keeping score, the TMA uses TDMs to reduce SOVs, and RPP is one of those TDMs.
Right.
Okay.
You got it.
Bingo.
For anyone involved.
So how would you grade the progress so far?
I don't know if I'd put a letter grade on it right now.
After all those letters we just had?
You give them an eye?
It's a work in progress. So it's definitely, I guess it is. It's an eye. As you said in your article, they aren't yet a nonprofit, but they have a steering committee that's very focused on trying to figure out what kind of pilot projects they're going to launch and what kind of structure are they going to have and how are they going to raise funds and how are they going to have carrots and sticks to make sure that we get the single occupancy vehicle trips to downtown reduced. As kind of just to step back a little bit, I think a really important thing for us all to think about in city leadership, in the community, and in the business community, business leadership, is something of an attitude shift or culture shift, which is that it's not just about cars and it's not just about parking, it's about access. We want people to be able to go downtown, whether that's somebody who's commuting from San Jose or Tracy or San Francisco, or it's somebody who lives on the other side of Palo Alto and just wants to go run an errand or come to City Hall to give us a hard time about something or whatever, or just go out for dinner, or even somebody from Menlo Park wants to come and have a cup of coffee somewhere in Palo Alto for a business meeting. We want to make sure that it's easy to access downtown Palo Alto. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that it's easy to drive there. But one of the ways I've always said it makes it easier for someone to drive is if they're not competing with a lot of other drivers. And that's why one of the things I think is most useful about the TMA and the work that they've done so far is kind of dispelling the myth that all of the parking problems and single occupancy vehicle or solo driver problems with downtown are all tech workers. Actually, tech workers are doing a pretty good job of not just driving alone. A lot of them, maybe even more than half of them, are now using other ways to get to work.
One of the figures that Gennady was able to get for the cover story was that there's a goal of 30% reduction of solo drivers, and that would total about 1,650 employees not commuting via solo driving. Do you feel like that's fast enough? Broken down over 4 years, that would be 400 people. This is, in some ways, we just want the problems to be solved immediately, don't we? I mean, so we have access and all the great things that we want out of downtown, but it's a process. 400 a year. Are there things that should be happening more swiftly, or do you think that there's a next step that really should be happening?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm as guilty as anyone of wanting the world and wanting it yesterday. Yeah. So, I want to be reasonable, but I still want to make sure that we don't take our eyes off the ball. I think that over the next few months, the council will be kind of refocusing on this. We basically set up the TMA about a year ago, and we've let them, the steering committee, and we've been letting them do their thing. From the council's perspective, city staff has been working with them pretty closely. And so I'd like to see council, and I think that council will be taking a look at it and just touching base with them and seeing how things are going. And we need to also work with them to figure out some long-range questions about how we can really facilitate what they're doing around funding and around motivation, whether it's carrots or sticks or just other forms of encouragement.
I think it was interesting. Exactly a year ago, last October, when Cory was running for city council, we asked him about the city shuttle program, which was the council was considering an expansion, and they actually did increase frequency for the two main routes in Marketdale across town. But at the time, the response was, it kind of doesn't go far enough. And the quote was, take the time to do it right, bring all the stakeholders to the table, the VTA, Stanford, VMware, Palantir, Google, downtown business associations that say, bring your innovative ideas, bring your checkbooks, let's figure this out. So first of all, I'll give you credit, they've done that. They've come to the table as far as the VTA, Google's there, Stanford's there, downtown stakeholders. So at least that part of it is happening, they're having those conversations. But one of the things that there is some debate right now as part of these conversations is, what should the city's involvement be? Do you believe that the city should be helping to fund this group, at least in the next year or two? And or should this be siphoned off into kind of become an independent group, self-sustainable?
Business funded.
Well, yeah, so yeah.
What should the city's role be going forward, I guess? That's kind of the question.
Well, I think we need to stay closely involved. We need to be a strong partner, if not, a leader. When it comes to identifying the funding for the TMA and long-term, long-range operating costs, I'm not in a position where I can say this is exactly the plan that we need. This is part of why I think it's important to bring the council back into the discussion at some point in the next couple of months, working with the TMA to figure out what the best funding solution is, whether it's membership fees or city funding or some money from parking, or I think more likely a mix. You've got a pot and you put different things in there, and so I think we need to have a really careful conversation about that. I certainly want to make sure that the city doesn't abdicate our responsibility to be the lead. We created and asked for the creation of the TMA because it's helping deal with maybe the most serious or one of the most serious issues in Palo Alto. And I'd also had on the shuttle, I'm really excited that I think in the next few months we're also going to get to talk about something that the city staff is working on, which is getting rolling a longer range vision for revamping our city shuttle. So for me, it's again really gratifying, really exciting. There's a lot of potential there.
It's called a 5-year plan, but I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean it's going to take 5 years to put together, or does it mean you're envisioning where the shuttle is going to be in 5 years?
I think
These solutions tend to coalesce kind of slowly.
Hopefully this one
Doesn't mention the comp plan. Did not mention the comp plan. Okay.
So hopefully it doesn't take 5 years to put our plan together. But I think it is important that, as I said a year ago, we need to figure out how to work together. And something else I'd mention, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, one of the members of the TMA, the Transportation Management Association, one of their steering committee members is Max McGee, the superintendent of the school district. This is, again, one of the important players when we're talking about traffic in Palo Alto, not just downtown, but throughout Palo Alto. A lot of our traffic comes from parents driving their kids to school. And so as long as we keep them engaged, both in the TMA discussion, but also in the larger city shuttle discussion, I think that's really important.
We thought we would try a lightning round with you, which is just asking you a couple of questions with quick answers about different topics that have come up through the year. And I kind of wanted to start off with that question. You've been on the council for 10 months now. You were an aide to Senator Jerry Hill, so you know how government works. But have there been surprises for you in just the kind of the pace of government now that you've been on the council?
I actually haven't been surprised at all. I think I did my homework before I decided to run for council. I talked to, I think, all of the current council members at the time, a lot of former council members, and asked them, what would I be getting myself into if I did this? Is this, what should I expect? And I think I had a pretty good sense of what to expect, and luckily I haven't been too surprised.
Yeah. There was a storyline during the election last year that you kind of took issue with, the idea that some people are pro-residentialist, others are against. Do you feel that this council has been split into two camps in any way, or do you feel like it's kind of coalesced towards the center? Have you seen a lot of kind of partisanship, like partisanism, I should say?
Well,
I don't mean it in the Democrats, Republicans. They just
right.
Because there was like a slate, that whole conversation last year.
So I think it depends on the issue. I think if you look at our votes, just like always in Palo Alto, votes will break down in different ways on different issues. Some people, care, are more focused on addressing our homelessness issue than others. Some people are more focused on stemming the pace of office growth than others. On that one, I'd put myself in the middle. Some people are more focused on housing than others. I'm probably more at the far pro-housing end. It really depends on the issue. And I'm glad that we all, I think, have a pretty cordial relationship.
Civility was one of the platforms that you were running on, figuring that after the Maybell referendum, there was a lot of divisiveness, some vitriol and hard rhetoric going on in the community. What do you think has happened in the past year in terms of civility?
Well, just to clarify, when I talked about and still talk about being civil and being just respectful of each other, that's not really a policy platform. That's just encouragement both to myself and to my friends, reminder to myself and my friends, as well as everyone in the community that if we are open to listening to each other, then we're not going to shut down or scare people off from offering innovative ideas. I think that's being civil, just being respectful and being open and listening is really essential to having good democracy. And I think we've been doing a pretty good job of that.
Do you think that that's just in some ways a function of Maybell receding into the distance, or do you think there have been active efforts to cultivate civility? And so what? What would those have been?
I'm not sure, where to place the thanks, but I think we're moving in that direction. I think that, again, going to, this housing issue, I think there's at least the start of a change in the community's understanding of how severe the issue is, and as we develop kind of a shared vision, at least in understanding the reality that our housing crisis is real, it's intricately tied to our transportation problems, and that our jobs, housing imbalance is also a core component of that. I think as we continue to see these pieces as inseparable, it improves the conversation.
You have time for one more question?
Go for it.
Cool. Well, last year you mentioned TMA was one of the most important things that the council did last year. What do you think is the most important action that the council has taken this year?
That's a good question.
Yes, got one.
Stumper.
I might have to think about that. I'm not sure if I have a single one. I'd say maybe a couple that were just personally important to me. One was the Buena Vista work that we did. After we resolved our quasi-judicial role, our decision to use the money that we had collected over years for affordable housing, say we're going to join with the county, if possible, to dedicate those affordable housing funds, at least a big chunk of them, to trying to preserve the residents of Buena Vista from being pushed out. That's a big one. And I also think that what we've done with the minimum wage is important. It's baby steps, towards addressing the larger issues of inequality in the region. But again, income inequality, housing, transportation, they all kind of tie together.
Great. Well, City Councilman Cory Wolbach, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You can always check us out on paloaltoonline.com or on Twitter @PaloAltoWeekly. That wraps it up for this week.